The Star Wars universe is crammed with superweapons capable of horrendous atrocities. They're present in canon and legends from the First Order's Starkiller base to the Dark Empire's World Devastators. But none is more notorious or iconic than the infamous Death Star. From the moment old Ben Kenobi says that's no moon, that's a space station, you know that this is going to be something forgettable. It's not the biggest or most powerful, but it's definitely unforgettable. However, because we know what happened to both Death Stars, it's easy to think the Empire was dumb or wrong to put insane resources into building them. In this video, I'm going to look at 6 logical reasons why the Empire wasn't wrong or stupid to construct the Death Stars, at least from a strategic perspective. Let me be clear from the start, I'm not justifying the Empire as a political entity. There's absolutely no doubt that it was beyond an evil regime. But it's still possible to rationalize some of its decision-making without supporting them. Let's get started. Let's start this video by talking about why the Empire actually built the Death Star in the first place. This is also mostly consistent across both the canon and Legends timelines. Everybody knows that the Death Star has a super laser capable of obliterating an entire planet. One of the earliest scenes we see involving the weapon is the destruction of Alderaan, one of the wealthiest core worlds. This is a shocking scene because it demonstrates the true power of the battle station and is incredibly foreboding for the rest of the galaxy. However, if we break down why they chose Alderaan and how the Empire planned to use the Death Star after, it becomes more interesting. Firstly, we need to consider who gave the orders to destroy Alderaan. Grand Moff Tarkin chooses Princess Leia's homeworld in Episode 4, despite her claims that the Rebel Alliance's base was on Dantooine. His immediate words are basically that Dantooine is too remote to be an effective example to the rest of the galaxy. Alderaan is a pacifist society with political clout and a strong economy in the most secure region of space. Tarkin opts for this world because it would show that nobody is safe. It's definitely psychopathic genocide, but it's not a moment of irrational madness on his part. This is an extremely pragmatic opinion, which makes it even more terrifying in my opinion. Alderaan is chosen for its symbolism and because it's Princess Leia's homeworld. Everything she loves is vaporized in an instant. Strategically, it also made sense because Senator Bail Organa was a known political agitator and rebel sympathizer. The Empire never proves in canon that he was working directly with the Rebel Alliance. This is a significant deviation from Legends, where Organa is even a prisoner on the Death Star in The Force Awakens. We see in the Andor series that Organa is extremely careful, taking fewer visible risks than Mon Mothma, for example. It also served the Empire to keep him around as a vocal political opponent because it gave them a veneer of legitimacy. That's why they didn't simply get rid of him when they had the chance. But everything changed after his adopted daughter, Princess Leia, and the Rebel Alliance stole the Death Star plans. Suddenly, Alderaan was at the forefront of Imperial opposition, making it the perfect target for the Death Star's initial test. Again, let's consider the person who was obsessed with the Death Star more than anyone else, Grand Moff Tarkin. Emperor Palpatine was the Empire's overall supreme leader and symbolic power, while Darth Vader was his ruthless hand, but it was Tarkin who was responsible for much of their day-to-day political and military ideology. In James Luceno's canon novel Tarkin, we learn how the future Grand Moff believed that the most effective way to rule the galaxy was through fear and domination. I've spoken about this in other videos, but it's crucial to understand, because the Death Star was the physical embodiment of the Tarkin doctrine. Consider all of the Empire's most iconic vehicles and spaceships, from the wedge-shaped Imperial Star Destroyer to the beast-like AT-AT. These ships and vehicles are actually less effective on massive open battlefields than Clone Wars precursors like the Venator-class Star Destroyer or the AT-TE. However, the Empire wasn't fighting huge campaigns with open warfare against an opponent of comparable strength. Instead, they weaponized fear and intimidation as a deterrent against resistance and uprisings. This brings us back to the Death Star. It was supposed to be the ultimate deterrent. Nobody would try to fight back against the Empire if they thought the punishment would be the destruction of their homeworld and everything they loved. Yes, it was extremely evil, but from the cold, logical view of a Sith Emperor, it was entirely logical. We can see from the perspectives of figures like Director Krennic in Andor, Tarkin in A New Hope, and even the Emperor in Episode 6. that their motive isn't to destroy the entire galaxy. This would be illogical because then there would be nothing to rule or exploit. The Rebel Alliance is so desperate to destroy it in the Return of the Jedi because they know that a completed Death Star will almost guarantee the end of their movement. It's worth noting too that not every species or world in the galaxy was against the Empire. The Essential Guide to Species is no longer fully canon, but it reveals that members of many species, including humans, Duros, Bothans, and Zabraks, aligned themselves with Imperial forces. Many people were content to get on with their lives and didn't concern themselves with extragalactic affairs. It's also worth noting that the destruction of Alderaan and the creation of the Death Stars weren't the first time that the Empire committed horrific atrocities and genocide. We see the horrific brutality on Gorman and Andor, but Tarkin was responsible for another massacre there when he landed his Star Destroyer on top of a huge crowd in a plaza. Other horrifying deeds in canon included the destruction of the Jedi Order in Order 66, the biological genocide of Geonosis, the repression of the Kaminoans, and the enslavement of the Mon Calamari, Wookiees, and Tals. The list goes on and on. There's even more in Lessons with the Kamasi genocide and the destruction of Dathomir. Ironically, the creation of the Death Star may have actually saved many lives because the rest of the galaxy may have submitted without a fight. I know this is an extremely controversial perspective, and it's definitely not a moral one, but if you're an ice-cold Sith Lord, it makes sense. Kinda like the threat of nuclear weapons in the real world. Nobody uses them because of mutually assured destruction. In this case, the obliteration would have only gone one way, but the principle is similar. Now, let's talk about the scale of the Death Star and how ridiculous it is that the Rebel Alliance succeeded in destroying 2 of them. These were massive space stations brimming with weaponry aside from their terrifying super lasers. Meanwhile, they had shields, armor, and fleets of capital ships that served to defend them. The first Death Star took over 20 years to build from unimaginable resources. Catalyst, a Rogue One novel, revealed that the Geonosians created the original plans under the guidance of Count Dooku, before the Empire took them over. According to the now Legends source, Star Wars Complete Locations, it had over 15,000 lasers, ion cannons, and turbo lasers, alongside 768 tractor beams. The first Death Star also had a complement of 7,000 to 9,000 TIE fighters, as well as dry docks for Star Destroyers and more than 1 million personnel. Of course, the Empire never completed the second, but it was on an even bigger scale. Star Wars, Absolutely Everything You Need to Know, says that it cost over 1 trillion credits to build the first Death Star. This is an astounding figure, but remember the Empire was exploiting most of the explored galaxy except Hutt space. They plundered planets for resources, including Kyber crystals from Ilum in Jedi Fallen Order, and Jedha in Rogue One. Many other planets had key resources too, such as Kessel and Mustafar for refined fuels and Durasteel. These weren't exactly subtle weapons, but in a way, the Death Star would actually streamline the Empire's military forces. After the fall of the Republic, the Empire found itself rebuilding its fleet and trying to justify maintaining its strength. I've already spoken at length about the Tarkin doctrine, but everything about the Imperial Star Destroyers and the later Executor class was designed to intimidate potential opponents. From the silhouette to their devastating firepower, they were extremely powerful ships. However, in an extremely ruthless and clinical way, it makes more sense to have one gigantic superweapon that can destroy a world than to maintain many fleets of ships in different sectors and regions of the galaxy. According to the canon reference book Starships and Speeders, each Imperial Star Destroyer cost 150 million credits to build. They had a full crew of up to 47,000, and it obviously took time to build them. The outrageous Executor-class Star Destroyer had a crew of over 250,000. General Tagg protested that the creation of the Death Star was a waste of resources, and that the Empire could basically construct unlimited Executor-class destroyers instead. Ultimately, as we see in the Marvel Darth Vader comic book series, his antagonism towards Palpatine's plans proved fatal. The reality is that Tagg missed the point. Yes, there's no doubt that super Star Destroyers like the Executor and Annihilator were terrifyingly massive. Their silhouettes filled the sky, and they had the raw firepower to incinerate almost any enemy capital ship. However, they lacked the sheer aura of the moon-sized Death Star, which could obliterate an entire planet with a single shot. Actually, a Executor-class destroyer can't even take down advanced planetary shields by itself. A Death Star could burn through them without any issue. Of course, the Death Star wouldn't eliminate the need for Star Destroyers, but in theory it would have allowed them to drastically reduce the scale of the fleet, allowing for quality over quantity. From a crew perspective, we can argue that while 1 million is outrageous, it's basically the equivalent of 4 Executor Star Destroyers, but because it's a planet buster, it would automatically settle disputes as soon as it appeared in a Resistance system. It's not a given that even a fleet of Executors would have the same instant effect. It would also enable the Empire to centralize the brightest and most loyal Imperial minds directly under Emperor Palpatine's rule. We see throughout Andor and Rogue One how corruption was rife throughout all areas of Imperial life, from ISB infighting to Director Krennic falsifying reports. In Rebels, the TIE Defender project is also sabotaged from within for political reasons. While many governors in the Outer Rim dealt with criminals and pursued their own selfish interests, it's no wonder that the Empire wanted to consolidate its power. As horrendous as the Death Stars were, they actually made sense from an Imperial perspective. Next, let's discuss what actually went wrong and why the destruction of the Death Stars wasn't as dumb as we might imagine. Firstly, it's easy to underestimate the sacrifice that the Rebels made to secure the first Death Star plans. We see this very clearly in Rogue One, where every member of the mission to steal them from Scarif lost their lives. The casualties included Cassian Andor, one of their most effective intelligence agents, and Jyn Erso, the daughter of the scientist who perfected the Death Star super laser. It was basically a suicide mission, and one that almost failed. The end of the movie showed Darth Vader cutting down a bunch of guardsmen on the Tantive 4 who bravely gave their lives up for the greater good. That moment when the stricken soldier passes the plans through a half-open door, knowing that his death is inevitable, is one of the most haunting moments in any Star Wars movie. The Rebels were willing to make the ultimate sacrifice to prevent the Empire from holding the decisive power in the galaxy. Clearly, the Empire underestimated how far they were ready to go, but there was also an incredible amount of luck involved. If any of these brave men and women hesitated and put their own safety ahead of the cause, the Empire would have reclaimed the plans. Then think about how unlikely it was that the 2 droids who escaped the Tantive 4 happened to encounter Luke Skywalker and Obi-Wan Kenobi on Tatooine, the actual son of Anakin Skywalker and his old Jedi Master. Oh, and don't forget Anakin built C-3PO as a kid, and that R2-D2 was his astromech. This is actually what happens, and the only way we can explain this is by accepting that destiny brought them together. The Force always seeks balance, and this works both ways in the Star Wars universe, as the fall of the Jedi Order proved in Revenge of the Sith. This is something intangible that no regular human engineer or scientist could ever comprehend when they were building the first Death Star. Even Emperor Palpatine himself, one of the most powerful Force users in galactic history, didn't consider that the Force could work against him. Obi-Wan famously said in Episode 4, "In my experience, there's no such thing as luck." He was absolutely right. That brings us to how the Rebels destroyed the first Death Star. Again, this was basically a suicide mission for Red and Gold squadrons, with somewhere between 30 and 40 casualties. Their target was a single 2-meter thermal exhaust port, a critical design fault deliberately and secretly created by Galen Erso. It's easy to see why Grand Moff Tarkin was so confident that the Death Star was invincible. He refused to evacuate the battle station or retreat because he justifiably thought the station was indestructible. The wildest aspect of this is that he would have been right if it weren't for Erso's defiant sabotage. Even so, it was still a near impossible task for the Rebels to destroy it. Luke compared it to shooting womp rats on Tatooine, but it's more like hunting for needles in a haystack. But this haystack was a deadly maze brimming with turbo lasers and an angry Sith Lord and a TIE advanced prototype trying to shoot you down. The Rebels had multiple failed runs, with turbo lasers and TIE fighters destroying many of their X-Wings and Y-Wings. Even Wedge Antilles, one of their top young hotshots, is forced to admit defeat. Ultimately, only Luke Skywalker is capable of locking onto the thermal exhaust port, but he doesn't do this through conventional technology. Instead, the voice of Ben Kenobi convinces him to use the Force and trust himself. Luke was one of maybe a handful of people in the entire galaxy capable of making this shot. Even the destruction of the second Death Star at Endor was more down to Palpatine's hubris than the battle station's flaws. Firstly, it wasn't even completed when the Empire leaked compromised intelligence to Bothan spies. This was a deliberate ploy to lure the Rebel fleet to its destruction, and it would have probably worked if Palpatine hadn't had an obsession with turning Luke Skywalker to the dark side. That's why he refused to allow Admiral Piet to move his Star Destroyers into offensive positions against the rebel Mon Calamari cruisers. He also opted to use the second Death Star as an offensive weapon against the rebel fleet, exposing it to danger. This was undoubtedly stupid, but it didn't mean that the plan to construct the battle station was inherently dumb. There's a reason why it inspired a bevy of other overpowered superweapons in Legends and canon, from Durga the Hutt's Darksaber to Kip Duran's Suncrusher to the First Order's Zeiston-class Star Destroyers and Starkiller Base. Fear is an extremely effective motivator and pacifier. This was also why the rebels surprised the Imperials by holding their ground in a last-ditch all-or-nothing assault to destroy the Emperor and the Death Star altogether. One of the most interesting and polarizing revisionist arguments about the Empire is that it arose out of the Republic's failures. This is true to an extent, but it doesn't give the full picture. There's no denying that the Republic became a victim of its own decadence and hubris. Massive corporations like the Trade Federation and Techno-Union managed to establish themselves as galactic powerhouses with more influence than many planets. The Neimoidian-led Trade Federation even had its own galactic senator. They took advantage of political deadlocks to hold entire planets and systems to ransom, such as Naboo in The Phantom Menace. It's an unfortunate reality that the Republic sleepwalked into chaos. Darth Sidious exploited this, manipulating the industrialist, separatist, and Republic forces into a brutal war of attrition against each other while secretly pulling the strings on both sides. However, the Republic, despite all its faults, attempted to rule through equal representation. It's entirely true that some planets, especially the core worlds, were more equal than others, but it was a system that mostly worked for over 1,000 generations. Meanwhile, the Empire rose and collapsed in just 25 years. But the Death Star was set to be the genesis of its extended longevity. The idea was simple. Nobody would mess with them if they had a planet-busting battle station. In many ways, the Empire was more efficient than the Republic. Its centralized authority meant that key figures like the Emperor, Darth Vader, and Grand Admiral Thrawn had absolute control of the forces and factions under their direct command. In theory, this enabled rapid law enforcement and military responses. This is also why the Empire was able to gather the resources to build its massive fleet of Star Destroyers and eventually 2 Death Stars. It's worth noting that the construction of the second Death Star was so rapid because they already had the supply chains in place. It's fun to speculate what would have happened if the Empire succeeded in completing the second Death Star, regardless of whether Sidious turned Luke to the dark side or not. I'm mostly going to focus on Legends for the next few minutes because these stories clearly show why building a superweapon like the Death Star wasn't such a dumb idea. The mapped Star Wars galaxy faces many external threats from the unknown regions and beyond in these novels, games, and comics. From the Seruvi incursions in the Truce at Bakura to the Yuuzhan Vong invasion in the New Jedi Order novels, the New Republic constantly found itself on the back foot. The Yuuzhan Vong are the most interesting example because they wreak havoc across the galaxy, totally destroying or terraforming entire worlds, including Ithor, Duro, and Coruscant. The novel Outbound Flight makes it very clear that the Jedi and the Sith detected an anomaly in the Force before the Clone Wars. Nobody was more prepared for this in Legends than Palpatine, who correctly believed that a massive invasion was inevitable and presented an existential threat to the galaxy. This was one of the key reasons why he maintained such heavy militarization after the Clone Wars and Legends. Yes, it's definitely to enforce his rule across the galaxy, but it's also in preparation for a threat beyond anything anyone can comprehend. Personally, this is something that I really like about Legends compared to the canon narrative because it gives Palpatine way more depth and purpose than just being an evil Sith. Outbound Flight reveals how Palpatine recruited Thrawn despite his anti-alien bias because he recognized his intellect and strategic brilliance. He dispatched Thrawn to explore the unknown regions and to help prepare the galaxy against the invaders. This also somewhat justifies the Death Star's construction because Palpatine believed it was his responsibility to save the galaxy. Yes, it's an unbelievably brutal weapon, and he probably had a messiah complex, but in Palpatine's eyes, harsh times demanded extreme methods. The Yuuzhan Vong wiped out entire worlds before the New Republic was able to adapt to their unique culture and biotechnology. It's highly likely that Palpatine wouldn't have suffered such heavy early losses, and may even have contained the carnage to a single corner of the galaxy. A superweapon like the Death Star would have been an invaluable tool against the Yuuzhan Vong. Palpatine could have directed its use as a conventional weapon against their live ships. He also wouldn't have hesitated to sacrifice strategically lesser planets in wild space or the Outer Rim regardless of civilian loss. This would have greatly lessened the Yuuzhan Vong's capacity to stockpile biomass and grow their population. Palpatine would have ruthlessly suppressed refugees if it eased pressure on key core worlds like Coruscant and Corellia. This might be a wild hot take, but go with me here. The Death Star could even have become a symbol of freedom and liberation. Yes, I know this may seem crazy, but the Yuuzhan Vong kill millions of sentient beings, from Vector Prime through to the Unifying Force. Palpatine could have even established himself as the galaxy's savior. Whatever happened after that is a mystery and probably wouldn't have been good. Again, none of this is canon anymore. The Grisk is the closest equivalent to the Yuuzhan Vong in Timothy Zahn's new Thrawn novels, but have yet to make the same impact in mainstream Star Wars movies or TV. Nonetheless, it's fascinating to consider, and it definitely gives the Death Star more meaning than just being an evil weapon of mass destruction. Finally, let's wrap this video up by considering what happened after the destruction of the Death Star in both canon and Legends. The short answer is that there was a wave of other superweapons. In the Legends novel Darksaber, Durga the Hutt attempts to construct a miniaturized Death Star laser because he wants to extort the galaxy and hold it to ransom. This actually goes against the wishes of his fellow Hutts, who identify him as a threat to their entire way of life. Then there's the Emperor Reborn in the Dark Empire series with his World Devastators. These lumbering superweapons churn up the surface of entire planets, converting their natural resources into war materials and leaving worlds ecologically devastated. Finally, there's the Sun Crusher, a much smaller but almost indestructible ship with the ability to destroy entire solar systems by artificially making stars go supernova. Kip Duran infamously does this when he's under the influence of Exar Kun in the Jedi Academy trilogy. All of this makes the Death Star seem subtle and moderate by comparison. Meanwhile, in canon, the First Order develops the Starkiller base, which is conceptually quite similar to the Sun Crusher. The Force Awakens shows us its full power. Arguably, the most dangerous aspect is that the First Order is a psychotic, extremist group without the rational, cold logic of the old Imperial leadership. It's fair to say that the Clone Emperor of the sequel trilogy is incredibly vengeful and erratic in his behavior. The First Order and the Sith Eternal don't repeat their Starkiller base experiment after its destruction. Instead, they focus on unleashing their Zeiston-class Star Destroyers. They're basically Imperial Star Destroyers with an axial super laser. The Rise of Skywalker Visual Dictionary offers the full specifications for these ridiculously overpowered ships. Star Wars Insider 220 explains that they were supposed to enforce Darth Sidious's galactic vision. However, that was also the role of the original Death Star. Ironically, the galaxy may not have suffered as much devastation if the second Death Star had been completed, because it would have been a single dominant force. This is only speculation, but Palpatine may not have bothered developing hundreds of Zeiston-class destroyers because they would have been overkill. There's also far more risk of a ship falling into an enemy's hands than a Death Star. It's fair to say that the Zeiston class is one of the most polarizing aspects of the sequel trilogy. Some fans justifiably criticize them and argue that an axial super laser is just too powerful for these ships and would have disintegrated them. However, regardless of our feeling, the reality is that they are canon now, so we just have to go with it. Nonetheless, despite all of their pocket-sized power, they will never have the sheer aura of a Death Star.